Okay, thank you very much for inviting me along today. So my name's Kym. I'm a psychotherapist that's been working with people with rare diseases since 2013, 2014. And we were introduced to the Childhood Tumour Trust at the beginning of this year. The Childhood Tumour Trust were looking at expanding their resources. They do a lot of work with children, but they were looking to expand their resources to do more work with parents, and they approached us to start thinking about running some online workshops and groups for their community. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about those today. So I'm not going to talk too much about the experience of a rare disease diagnosis like NF, because I know that all of you will be very familiar with that from your own experiences. But there's an increasing amount of evidence and research out there now that delays to diagnosis, lengthy disease odysseys, or the shock of an unexpected diagnosis has quite a profound impact on both families and individuals going forward. And one of the things that I have a particular interest in is about how the diagnosis of a rare condition like NF can set the trajectory for the tone, the feeling about the condition moving forward. So the way in which diagnosis is delivered and the way in which families and individuals are supported at diagnosis has a very profound sort of ripple out effect for families and individuals going forward. So just to talk a little bit about the context in which we came to be running these online workshops, and they came up really from the pandemic and a number of online support that CTT, like many organisations, started to provide for the children of their members. But what they were also picking up was the degree of distress, quite understandably, that was coming to the fore from the pandemic, but also children who were being diagnosed during that period of time, often having to wait for care, and also care being disrupted. So one of the things that they approached us to do was say, can you offer something for our parents who are both newly diagnosed, but may have been diagnosed for some time? And we thought with CTT for some time actually about whether we offer these workshops just for families who've been newly diagnosed, or whether it might in fact be helpful to offer them to families who've been diagnosed for some time. And the rationale for that was that really on the basis that there is so little support that's often offered around diagnosis, and the opportunity to talk more might be helpful, but also to be able to share the experience of diagnosis over time and how both the parents' experiences but their children's experiences of NF1 and their relationship to the condition changes over the course of a lifetime and at different developmental milestones during that. So really it came out of the recognition of an unmet need for additional emotional psychological support for parents, both generally and specifically. So the aims of the workshop, we had 5 key concepts, and the first really was to help normalise the range of feelings at diagnosis and beyond. And we have a very strong emphasis that dealing with diagnosis emotionally and psychologically for parents is an activity that happens over time. It's not something where we believe, you can have a few counselling sessions and you're completely adjusted and fine and understand the impact of it. That dealing with diagnosis goes through waves, ebbs and flows over the course of your relationship with the condition as a parent. But the intensity of the feelings of diagnosis may re-emerge at other points during your relationship with the condition and as your child grows up. And we call this the emergent echo of difficult or painful feelings. And we wanted to sort of get across to parents the idea that these difficult or painful feelings that might have been around at initial diagnosis might re-emerge at other points, quite often around developmental milestones. If you see the children of friends or other family members, perhaps reaching developmental milestones earlier or in a different way to your own children, that again may cause feelings to come up that are painful about processing the living with NF1. And what we also called the unexpected grief, the sort of unbidden emergence of feelings at points where it's quite unexpected. We had one of our parents talk about how she'd been feeling really quite positive about living with NF. Things seemed quite stable. Her daughter was doing reasonably well. And she was just slightly felled out of nowhere by watching her child in a playground, unable to do something that her friend was able to do. And she said, I was completely, it just hit me out of the blue. I thought things were fine. I thought we were getting on really well. And she was hit by a wave of grief in that moment. And of course, the other point in which you can get an emergence of those initial feelings that might have been around at diagnosis, or if your child starts to get new or increasing symptoms as they go along. And what we were really trying to get across to parents was this is quite normal, this is quite to be expected, and the importance of being kind to yourself during that period of time, rather than seeing it as something that is wrong or you haven't adapted or adjusted as well as you wished you could. And the other thing we really wanted to make time for in the workshops was the idea that parents and children have a different experience of and feelings about their NF. And really that rests upon the idea that as a parent, you will have had to adapt to the idea of your child having NF. Whereas for your children, it's part of their identity from the very start and from the very outset. And I think this links a bit to something that the class was touching on at the end about supporting parents to talk freely and openly about NF with their children, and how helpful that is if it can be integrated into the sense of themselves and their identity from very young, rather than, as class was saying, sort of introduced as an idea much later on. So as a parent, very much you're having to process the sense of grief and loss that the childhood you perhaps imagined for your child is not going to be quite as straightforward, because your child is living with this condition, NF1. So we were introducing the idea that owning your own feelings allows you to help your child with theirs, and not muddling up your own feelings with how your child might feel about living with NF1. That it's okay for you both to be different. And then the other concept that was key to these workshops was that making time to attend to your own mental health and well-being is key. We're really aware with any rare condition, the focus is often on supporting the individual with the condition, and parents so often, they are key and crucial to their child's mental health and well-being. But if their own is not attended to, nothing works very well. Parents keep the show on the road, as we sometimes put it. So your own mental health and well-being is absolutely key in this process. So the groups were small groups. We had a maximum of 15 participants, and that was intentional on our part, so that it was a small enough group for people to talk freely, but also not too big. It was a closed Zoom event, and we were quite clear that unfortunately if people came more than 10 minutes late, we couldn't let them in to be part of the group. And that was really to create a sense of safety and a sort of mini community really for that period of time over which we were meeting. And we met just for 1.5 to 2 hours on a midweek evening, and we had very clear agreed boundaries that were sent out at the start about confidentiality and respect for difference to help make the groups feel safe. And CTT recruited through their closed Facebook groups, through some of their social media, and also by reaching out directly to some of their parents that they knew were struggling. And as I said, we went all around the houses with this. Do we open this out just to those newly diagnosed under, say, a year or to 2 years? or do we open it out to those that are longer term diagnosed too? And we felt that there would be benefit in being able to share, if you were a parent whose child had been diagnosed for longer, the experience of that with those both newly diagnosed, but also the opportunity to see how far you might have come and how far your child might have come in that time. And to evidence the need, I think those initial workshops were fully subscribed within 72 hours, and they were oversubscribed by 100%. So there was something about offering this workshop up to parents as a time to come and meet with others and talk through your experience of diagnosis and beyond that parents were very ready for. So we ran 5 workshops from February to October this year, and I'll talk a little bit about this in a moment, but one of the outcomes of those early workshops was a follow-up workshop, which was, again, dealing with this issue that the class mentioned about how to talk about NF with your child, how to talk about it in a way that helps them integrate it into their identity and themselves in a positive way from very early on. We had over 60 who signed up, and we had 46 who attended the workshops overall. And I think that's not surprising in that I think with any workshops, there's always a fallout rate. But given that as parents, you're often juggling lots of different concerns, and that it's not necessarily easy to come and think about talking to people you don't know at all about your feelings about things, we were quite pleased that the attendance rate was as high as it was. Out of that, of note to us that we only had 3 dads who attended. So there's a whole sort of piece of work and thinking there about where the dads are and what the dads' feelings are about talking about their children's experiences and their own. And we had a pretty low take up too from BAME parents. So there's another piece of work and thinking about outreach there. So the ages of the children of our parents range from under 12 months all the way up to 19 years. So we had a really big range across our workshops. And the length of time from diagnosis varied from under 6 months to 15 years. So you can see a real range of parents there. And we also had one pre-adoptive parent who was just about to, within the next few months, adopt a little girl, I think, with NF1. So our content was a mixture of sort of taught and discussion based, so a facilitated led discussion really. We spent quite a lot of time at the start establishing aims and safety and getting across the idea that this was a time for you as a parent. This was turning the focus away from your child's needs and onto your needs. How were you living with NF1? How were you coping? And introducing the idea of dealing with diagnosis as an activity over time, that it's not a one-off thing, but that the echoes of those early diagnostic experiences, the fears and the anxieties re-emerge at different points. And that's okay, that's understandable, being on the lookout for them sometimes and thinking about what helps you deal with them, what helps you feel safer and more reassured in the present than perhaps you felt originally. What are the things you can do to look after yourself now? So we did quite a bit of time naming difficult feelings, and then we went on to talk about noticing your own personal distress signs. What is it that you start to do when you're not coping so well, or you're feeling stressed? Do you get aches and pains? Do you start to eat a lot or not eat much, or does it come out in drinking or withdrawing or not wanting to be alone? And then exploring some of the coping strategies for that and self-care strategies. One of the things that came out in all the groups, and I'll talk a little bit about in a moment, was the tensions that can be between couples when you have very different coping strategies. Parents often talked a lot about perhaps one of them would be the real researcher, the one who takes the lead, who wants to know everything about NF. And then the other partner might be the one who takes more of a backseat, finds it much harder to be engaged is a bit more withdrawn and sort of distant from dealing with NF, and the tensions that can cause sometimes within families. And we also introduced the idea of being a good enough parent, which is a phrase it's a lovely phrase from a psychotherapist, who's quite old, back in the 50s now, called Winnicott. And because one of the things we noticed was that there was a real theme of guilt and parents always feeling they weren't doing enough, that they should be doing more. So the idea of being good enough rather than the perfect parent, and congratulating yourself for what you do well, not for what you don't do so well. And also the idea that self-care and other care are intrinsically related, that if you're looking after yourself, you are also by default looking after others. And one of the phrases that came up, I've paraphrased here, one of the mums said, yeah, I have needs too, but it's so hard to find time for them. And I think this was, of course, never truer than during the pandemic, when people were juggling perhaps work lives, care for your NF child, care for your other children. It really came home to everyone during that time what a struggle that period was. So it might be helpful just to share with you the themes that emerged in the guided discussions. And one of the things we were very struck by was how many parents felt abandoned really by healthcare services after the initial diagnosis. In several of our groups, parents talked about having been asked to go home and keep an eye out. And many of the parents said, what did that actually mean? No one explained to us what keeping an eye out meant. What am I meant to be watching for? What am I meant to be waiting for? So somewhere along the line, there is a piece of work about communication from healthcare professionals to parents in the early stages of diagnosis, and how alone and anxious that made parents at that time. Another theme that emerged throughout really was the impact on the couple relationship and wider family dynamics and different coping strategies. And that idea of within a family, the sort of polarizing between the idea of let's not make too much of a fuss about it, let's not talk about it too much, and then that running up against parents or other family members who felt that they wanted to have NF much more out there on the agenda, be able to talk about it and be able to teach other family members about the condition and the implications of it, and the tensions that could sometimes arise both between couples but in extended family dynamics too, around that question of what place does NF have in the family. Loss was a theme that came up. Many of our parents had perhaps given up or reduced their working lives or aspects of their social lives in order to spend more time caring for their NF child and possibly other children too. And exhaustion was also a theme, I think, particularly the earlier workshops we gave when the pandemic was still very, very present. A lot of families were homeschooling. Respite care that some of them might have had probably been dropped, and just how emotionally and physically exhausted a lot of parents were at that point. And this was a word that came up quite a lot, and there's quite an interesting report coming out later on this year, which I'd encourage you all to read actually, which is about, it's by someone called Tom Kenny, and it's about the psychological impact of diagnosis of a rare condition, and it is very relevant to a lot of NF families, in my opinion. And it's the idea that diagnosis is in itself a trauma, and a trauma for families. And it was interesting that when we mentioned this almost in passing, it was something that families and parents really seized upon, about how traumatic it had felt to be given their diagnosis, and often to be given that diagnosis with little holding or support from healthcare professionals during that. But that also there can be an aspect of ongoing trauma too. And some of our parents for the first time talked about how upsetting it was to have to hold their child during distressing procedures or after surgeries or witness their child struggle to do something that caused them pain or distress, or experiences at school in finding friendships or making relationships. So the group really took up this idea of trauma, which we thought was quite interesting, really, and maybe is quite an unacknowledged aspect of parenting with NF. And then also fears for the future came very much to the fore. And we tracked a little, not formally, but just in amongst ourselves, the emotional themes that came up, which was around grief, the grief that this was not the childhood you'd expected for your child. This is not necessarily the parenting experience you'd expected to have. The loneliness, this was the first time many of our parents had met with other parents and been able to talk openly about their experiences. And I would say that alone was the fundamentally most therapeutic thing of the groups, the opportunity to meet and talk about your feelings with other parents. The groups were also very funny. There were tears, but there was also a lot of laughter too, actually. People talked about sometimes responses to schools or to friends or in family situations about things that were difficult, and the pleasure of having other parents get it. There was anger too about, having to live with NF at all, and the frustrations of navigating health and social care and other people's opinions. So things that I'm sure that many of you here will be very familiar with. And one of the phrases that stuck with me was when one of our participants said, I love my daughter very much, but having a child with NF1 was not on my bucket list when I first got married. And there was a lot of empathy when she said that in the group, that no one here has sought out having NF as part of their life. We're making our best way with it as best we can. So we made a number of sort of general observations from the workshops. One of the things, certainly in those that chose to come to the workshops, this may not be a general observation, but those who chose to sign up, there were a lot of unworked through feelings of distress, and probably it's not too strong to say unprocessed trauma, particularly around those, the way in which diagnosis might have been delivered, or the way in which it came about, or perhaps encounters with healthcare professionals or services in the early stages of diagnosis, which really damaged trust, I think, in healthcare professionals. A real readiness to engage in the group. We really wondered how freely people would talk to each other, and what would emerge, but just a real joy, actually, even in those who were cautious about, I'm not sure about groups, I'm not sure how much I want to say. People really engaged in the group and shared their experiences and talked very freely. One of the things that came up a lot, which might be useful to note, is a real confusion about genetic and psychological counselling. I don't know whether that's true in other countries, but in the UK, we touched on how few parents have been offered psychological support or counselling after diagnosis. And some said, oh, well, I had a couple of sessions, or I had a session with a genetic counsellor, and myself and my colleague talking about the difference between genetic counselling, which is very information-based, and psychological counselling, which is much more relationship-based over time. And a number of parents feeling that they had already had counselling because they'd had a genetic consultation, and not realising that they might still be able to approach their GP or others for support and counselling themselves. And as part of that, ambivalence and shame about seeking counselling if they were struggling, in a way that I think stigma still exists. I think it's changing, but I think stigma still exists about being able to say, look, I'm struggling, can I have some support? And the need for post-workshop support and resources, a desire for more connection. And also that there was a very widely varying degree of acceptance, adjustment and coping with NF, even in parents who might have had their diagnosis for a very long time, there wasn't necessarily a correlation between how long you'd had the diagnosis and how well you were coping with living with the condition. And again, we were very struck by this ebb and flow. So just a couple of things that struck us, which was, at the point of diagnosis, there just still seems to be a need for very clear guidelines, support and signposting for parents to both medical healthcare professionals and patient organisations. A lot of them hadn't heard about Childhood Tumour Trust or didn't know there were patient organisations out there for quite some time, and they'd found their way to them themselves rather than been given that information. The other thing that came out as a theme quite a lot was that the commitment of one key healthcare professional made a huge difference to a family. That might have been a GP or a health visitor, but that really made a difference in being able to cope emotionally and feel held and safe during the early stages of diagnosis. And very few, I think none, we didn't check this, were offered access to psychology or counselling support at the point of diagnosis. So just very quickly before I finish, we had a couple of outcomes from this, which was that CTT were able to take back some of the findings from the workshops and obtain funding for some further support. One of which was what we call Dealing with Diagnosis Part 2 workshops, which was helping your child with their feelings. And really that was about, how do you talk to your child about NF? What do you say that is age appropriate at what time? Giving parents more confidence to just have ordinary conversations about NF and get across this idea that NF is just part of your life. It's not all of who you are, but it's part of who you are. And it also contributed to evidencing the need for funding of a 12-month pilot counselling service, which is just about to start in December this year. And then we're just putting together with CTT2 for next year something we're calling a parental resilience programme. And that will be a 12-week pilot open to parents to really support them in living as well as possible with the condition and supporting their child. And I just put a couple of comments and quotes back there that we had in our feedback from the workshops. I realise I've run over time, so class, I hope that gives you all a little bit of a flavour of the workshops. They were a real privilege for us to run, and a lot came out of them really. And I hope that just gives you a little bit of a flavour and a bit of insight into the project that CTT has been running with us over the last year. Thank you.